Good morning, California and mountains, and good afternoon, East Coast. This is Ben Ruddle. I'm the director of the Fusion Project. That's a National Science Foundation and U.S. Department of Agriculture funded project that's funded by the Infuse program. We are mapping the food, energy, and water systems of the United States and studying their resilience and their productivity, among other things. You can find more out about that project at our website, which is fewsion.us. I want to thank CUAHSI for hosting this cyber seminar series. I think it's a great service to the community and a great way to provide visibility to people who are doing, especially doing data-centric or innovative hydrology work. And so thanks to everybody who decided to attend. Looks like we have 30 attendees, which is great. So welcome everyone. I want to introduce our speaker today. It's Landon Marston. Landon is an assistant professor for the last couple years at Kansas State University. He's in civil engineering, and he does a variety of work on water resources in the United States. This is a talk that I'm actually, I should disclose, myself along with some others from the project are co-authors on this research, and so it's something I'm particularly fond of. He's going to be talking about water footprint benchmarks for the United States, and there's content from a number of publications involved in this talk. I'll let Landon go through the details. I want to ask everybody to hold questions until the end, please. You can go ahead and type those in to the questions box and get them on the record, or you can wait until the end to ask. And hopefully we'll be able to wrap up around 11:45 Mountain Time, and that's my time. I'm in Arizona, and so that's going to be about 45 minutes of conversation, and then we'll hopefully have enough time for 10 or 15 minutes of questions at the end. So with no further ado, Landon, please go ahead with your talk.
All right, great. Thanks for the introduction, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Ben said, my name is Landon Marston, and I'm an assistant professor in the civil engineering department at Kansas State University. I've been working with the Fusion Project and Ben for a couple of years now, and this, while the Fusion Project is interested in food, energy, and water, this talk today has more of a water bent. We talk about how water is used in the entire U.S. economy, including energy production and food production. And we're really, the focus of today's talk is how can we use water more effectively and more efficiently throughout the economy. And so during the talk, I'm going to break it down into three different components. The first is high resolution sectoral water footprint. So this is based off a paper that was published in Water Resources Research back in 2018. And that really lays the foundation for the title of this presentation, which is how do we determine water footprint benchmarks? And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how that was determined in a few minutes. And then we'll conclude the talk with some kind of final remarks and ways forward from here. So let's start first with the paper that lays the foundation, the data creation that lays the foundation for the analysis that we're going to be doing, that we hope to submit for publication here soon. But this work that we're going to describe now has already been published, as I mentioned earlier. And so really this study is based in the U.S., and we look at how the U.S. is supported, U.S. economy is supported by water. And so many of us dealing in our careers being focused on water realize the interconnections between food, energy, and water. But for the layperson, it's often hidden because that water is not directly used when they turn on their lights, for instance. So people aren't often aware of how much water it takes to produce the energy that travels into their house to turn on many of the products that they use every day. And that can manifest itself depending on where the electricity comes from. It can be thermoelectric power generation, so you kind of see that in the graphic, the tremendous amount of water that is required to produce that energy. And then there's more traditional methods like oil production, and now with hydraulic fracturing that can require a tremendous amount of water to produce. And now with bioethanol, when we fuel our cars, that bioethanol requires a tremendous amount of water in order to produce that. And so there's this tight integration between the energy that we use every day and the water needed to produce that energy. Likewise, there's a lot of water is required to produce the food that we eat. In fact, most of the water used in the U.S. economy, as I'll show later, is used for food production. And this is often displaced from where we consume the food. The food production occurs in places often far removed from where it's often consumed. And this is going to be the amount of water needed to grow that food is expected to increase as the amount of food that we eat is expected to increase with growing populations and shifting diets. And this is all kind of under the changes that are expected to occur, both in terms of climate change, with dry regions becoming more dry and wetter regions becoming wetter, and the temporal distribution of rainfall and the volume of that rainfall. But also, we're becoming more cognizant of other needs that we've often neglected in the past, and those are mainly environmental needs. And so as we allocate more water to the environment, that means there's trade-offs as we take water perhaps away from other water users. And so the United States acts as kind of a microcosm of the larger global changes that are occurring, both in terms of climate and population dynamics. And often a lot of the goods that we produce here in the United States aren't simply for our own consumption, but are used, but are sent around the world as the world becomes more and more globalized. The products we produce and the water that's needed to produce those products are often sometimes far removed from the place of production, and the place of consumption are separated by great distances. And so if we want to understand how water is used within the economy, and we want to make these connections more explicit, then I think the simplest thing to do would just be to go to Washington, D.C., or perhaps to the middle of the country in Kansas, and just look at the giant water meter there and see how much water we use across all the sectors within the economy. Well, clearly that's not the case. There's not a giant meter anywhere in the U.S. where we can easily quantify how much water is being used. In fact, there are millions of water users across the United States, whether that's residential water users, the water that comes directly to your house, or it could be a commercial or industrial enterprise that uses water. And then not to mention the over 200,000 different irrigators across the United States, which also use a tremendous amount of water. So now this quickly becomes a big data problem. We have millions of water users and all this data collected at a fine scale, and trying to bring all this together and synthesize it in a way that makes sense we can do something with. Well, it would be a big data problem, except that this data doesn't exist for the most part. And so most water users are not metered. And in fact, some of the largest water users, especially in the agricultural sector, are not metered at all. Very few are. And so then the question becomes, if it's so important to understand how we use water within the economy and how that's going to change in the future with all the, like I mentioned, the climate change and population changes that are going to be occurring, if we all agree that it's important to understand that, how that changes the hydrology and so forth and water supplies, how do we produce reasonable estimates of how much water is being used? Well, what's been done in the past and what we've kind of employed within this study is it's taking things that we do know, so information perhaps on climate or revenue that's been generated for a particular industry, or it could be for crops, it could be crop production or yield. In some industries, the labor force is a better indicator of how much water is being used. And so we can take this information that we do know, and we can translate that through water use coefficients into how much water is actually being used within that industry. And so this is what's been done, not just by researchers, but also what's often held as the gold standard, the United States Geological Survey water use census. While some of the data that they report is metered, especially on the public supply side, much of it is estimated based on coefficients, much like I'm describing now. And so when we talk about water use coefficients, often we run into two different problems. So usually they're one of two extremes, rather. And so oftentimes they're very, very specific. And so maybe a study has taken place in a small town or some town, and they look at a specific company. And so I show the example here of some Volkswagen plant, and maybe the study looks at how much water is being used within that plant. And so they take some kind of audit and determine how much water is being used. On the other extreme, you might have these national estimates of all of industry. And so this might include, bread manufacturing with car manufacturing. These are all lumped together, and it's done at a national level. And I've seen several studies that have used these national estimates and applied them to other nations even. So we have these two extremes, but there's nothing really in between, the kind of the mesoscale, the county to state scale, that gives us the spatial detail that we need while still giving complete national coverage. So that's kind of really what motivated this work and what we aim to do here. And it really follows kind of what's gone on in hydrology over the last several decades, moving from these very kind of lumped estimates to more gridded and refined estimates. And so we aim to do the same thing here by moving from, these one industry that defines all industries to breaking that down into multiple industries and trying to determine what each of those individual industries' water use is. And likewise, moving from the kind of these national estimates to sub-state and sometimes even county level estimates of what water use is for different sectors of the economy. And so the research goal, our motivation behind this was to create this spatially explicit and distinct industry mapping of U.S. economy's water consumption. And the three main questions we had in mind were, how much water is required to support each U.S. industry? That's the first question. The second one is, how does economic water use vary across the country? So we capture both the spatial element that we discussed earlier and also the sectorial resolution that we desire. And then thirdly, we want to know, do industries depend more on water directly or indirectly through their supply chain? So do they use water more in their facilities, or do they use more water indirectly through the products that they use as inputs in their major production processes? And so this paper aims to address all three of those questions. And I think before we really get into the kind of the nitty-gritty of the details of the study and the results, I think I'm going to take a step back, and in case anyone hasn't heard of these virtual water or water footprint, let me quickly define that. And so water footprint, or virtual water, sometimes used interchangeably, is the water embedded within the production of a good. So this is usually shown in the agricultural sector because water is used most intensely within that sector. And so these figures are from Hoekstra and McConan, as well as Megan Konar, and one of my students, Zoe Ao, is on this paper that I'm describing now. And so these figures are really nice illustrations of how much water on average is required. And perhaps some of the things, if you're eating while I'm talking right now, and maybe perhaps this is your lunchtime, some of the things that we often consume every day and how much water it takes to produce those things. And so, for instance, the hamburger you see on your right takes 2,400 liters of water to produce. Now, that's not to say if you bite into the hamburger, water is going to come gushing out. But what it is saying is back through the entire supply chain, it takes roughly that much water to produce that one hamburger. And most of that's going to occur early in the supply chain when we're talking about production of animal feed crops. And so when that water footprint is often broken down into blue and green water footprint, with green water footprint being soil moisture provided by rainfall, blue water being further distinguished between surface water and groundwater sources. And so I can't, because of the sake of time and because this also isn't the key focus of this talk, I'm not going to go into great detail, but suffice to say, we spent a lot of time and collected almost 100 data products and synthesized them together to determine what the average footprints, the water footprints were in distinct areas and for distinct sectors of the economy. So we kind of grouped those sectors together here, or those industries together here, and showed some of the data that we use for each of those. I would point you toward the paper, and I'll have the paper listed at the end of this talk if you want to get into more details of how each of these were calculated. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this and get straight to the results. And so, as I mentioned earlier, crops and the food that we eat is what requires most of the water that's used within the economy. And so you can, showing this here spatially, you see that there is, if you look at the groundwater footprints, which is on the right, that's the WF stands for water footprint. You might see that a few more times throughout the presentation. You can clearly see, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not. Let me see if I can pull up this highlighter here. You can clearly see the boundaries of some of the major aquifers, right? So the High Plains Aquifer, the Mississippi Embayment Aquifer here, the Central Valley aquifer. So areas where we see large extractions of groundwater also correspond to large aquifers, and many of which are being overexploited. Surface water footprint for crop production mainly occurs in the western United States, as we would expect. The green water footprint, this is largely kind of in the Midwest, kind of Corn Belt region. A lot of that's rain fed. A lot of the land is dedicated toward crop production in these states. And then our total water footprint shown here. This is a combination of all surface water, groundwater, and green water. And so 95%, and just to show you, kind of put a number with that, I've been mentioning how much of the U.S. economy's water use is for crop production. This is putting a precise number. 95% of the U.S. water footprint is due to crop production. This is, again, for the economic production. It doesn't include domestic water use and the like. Now, I will say of that 95%, roughly 80, or about 85% of that total is just for green water. And so even though you can compare each of these individual crops against each other within these two figures, you can't compare them across each of the figures, because this would be much, much larger, demonstrating our dependency on rain-fed crops within the United States and the water that rainfall produces. There's been several people in the literature that have kind of, I won't say raised concerns, but wanted to highlight the fact of our dependency on green water and how that might change, as climate changes, might change how we produce crops and what is irrigated and what is not irrigated. And another thing I wanted to point out is that just 7 crops grown in the United States are responsible for 3/4 of groundwater consumption. And so that's not just within the crop sector, that's across all sectors. 3/4 of U.S. groundwater consumption is due to just 7 crops that are being produced. And then 1/2 of U.S. surface water consumption is due to those same 7 crops. And those 7 crops, corn grain, corn silage, hay and haylage, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and almonds is the other one. Those 7 require a tremendous amount of water. And if you notice, as I ran through that list, a lot of those are just for animal feed. And so this is a really neat figure that I saw in a Bloomberg article last year that showed how much land is dedicated to different things. But we really want to look at how much is dedicated to animal feed production. You see 41% of U.S. land is dedicated to feeding livestock. And what I just demonstrated on the last slide is a similar amount of water, actually a little bit more than that. The water that we use is dedicated toward livestock production. So there's been a lot of papers that have come out in the last few years looking at how our diets impact sustainability of our resources, and specifically water. And I think this kind of highlights that fact here as well in our study. If we step out a little bit further from just the livestock and look at agriculture in general, we find that agriculture is the top water user in 7 of 10 counties within the United States. And perhaps it'd be even larger than that if we didn't divide agriculture into numerous sectors, just to get a little more specificity on which particular production within agriculture that we're looking at within each area. We find that 10% of U.S. counties consume about 3/4 of all the water that's used within the United States. So there's over 3,000 counties, so roughly 300 counties within the United States consume about 75% of the water. So there's certainly some equity as far as distribution, that it goes on there. Maybe in some way argue it's not equitably distributed, but others might argue that, well, these counties are using that water because they're producing goods that we elsewhere in the United States are going to ultimately consume. So we're kind of outsourcing our water use to other places across the United States. And since this is a few project, and to look into the connections between food and energy, I'm mainly focused on food thus far. I want to kind of show how these are related. And so the green line that you see here is the water used for food production. So on the y-axis, it shows the cumulative amount of the water used across the United States as we work from the West Coast to the East Coast. And so you can see one thing I wanted to point out when you look at the green line is we see that water used in food production, we see these sharp upticks where those major aquifers we talked about earlier are located. So with Central Valley Aquifer located here in California, the High Plains Aquifer, we see another kind of strong uptick. where the High Plains Aquifer is at, and then the Mississippi Embayment Aquifer, another one. Also, a plot against that, a lot of the infrastructure, and this is mainly dam storage for irrigation purposes. Most of that's going to occur in the western United States. And although most of our cropland shown here in brown is actually going to occur in the Midwest region and kind of in the eastern part of the United States. So a lot of our water use occurs in one side of the United States, where most of our cropland is kind of in the center and kind of the eastern part of the United States. And then we show where people actually live here in red. So you see a lot of the population is distributed here on the eastern part of the United States, with some upticks in California and major cities. And then lastly, we show the water for energy use. And so this is interesting because we show here, this is where precipitation roughly equals potential evapotranspiration around the 97th meridian. And interestingly enough, roughly 80% of the water used in food production occurs to the west of this line, whereas 80% of water used in energy production actually occurs to the east of this line. And so we're not exactly sure, why that is necessarily. Well, I mean, there's just, obviously in the more arid regions, you need more water to produce food, but you also see, I guess, a higher propensity for thermoelectric power production in the east, and that largely corresponds to where people live as well, and energy demand associated with those. But interesting nonetheless that's kind of the P equals PT line acts as some kind of a threshold line for both of those, water for food and water for energy. I'm just going to change slides here for me. 1 second. Okay. If we're looking at non-agriculture industries or non-crop production industries, the water footprint of these is mainly the major water users are actually hydropower and non-revenue water. So these are parts of the economy, or losses rather, that we often don't consider, but that can be quite significant. And so many maybe think of hydropower as inline water use and really doesn't consume any water. And depending on how you think of it, I suppose that could be true, but a lot of people are growingly beginning to recognize that there's a great amount of evaporation that occurs behind these hydropower dams. And so if we account for that, it requires a tremendous amount of water to produce that energy. And so we used the data that came to make that analysis. Actually didn't come from us. I want to give credit to Emily Gruppert. She produced this study back in 2016. So we utilized the data from her study. It looked at the hydropower water footprints across the United States. The non-revenue water was calculating that came from a series of investigations looking at every major metropolitan area across the United States and collecting data on their percentage of the water that's non-revenue water, meaning that it actually doesn't make it to consumers. It's lost somewhere within the system or not paid for. If we assume that's all consumed, that can be a tremendous amount of water loss within our system, our water use within our system. And other big players are thermoelectric power production, both recirculating and once through technologies. So this figure, let me kind of walk you through this one. It's perhaps a little bit more difficult to understand. And so the key takeaway here is that 93% of sectors use more water through their supply chains, meaning they use this indirectly through the products that they source as inputs in their production processes than they actually use directly within their facilities. So this is one of the key questions we wanted to answer. And what you see here in orange is the average of so basically if they source their goods from an average water producer. So within a given industry, let's say if there's 10 companies within the industry, and we determine what the average water use is to produce X good. If you take the average, that average, and you say, well, we're going to buy our inputs from the average, then 93% of all water use would occur indirectly back through your supply chain. However, if you decide to source from the more efficient water users, then much less percent, like around 70% of your water use comes indirectly back through the supply chain. Whereas if you source, or see, this is backwards. So the blue is going to be your most efficient, your gray is going to be your least efficient. In which case, roughly 99% of industries would then use more water indirectly back through their supply chains than they use directly. I should have said this sooner, but this black dotted line signifies where your direct use is going to be. If you're to the right of this line, so each one of these dots represents a specific industry. If you're to the right of this line, you use more water directly in your production facility than you use indirectly back through your supply chain. Whereas if you're to the left of this line, use more water indirectly back through the products that you purchase than you use directly. So let me kind of give an example here. And so this is for the sugar industry. And so here we have, again, depending on where your overall water footprint of production is largely dependent on where you source your inputs. And so if a sugar and confectionery product manufacturing facility is going to produce a 5-pound bag of sugar, right, and we're going to buy that at the store, how much water does it take to produce that? So we're showing this in gallons. If they source their goods, so this is going to be like their direct water use, and so on average, depending on where they're located, this is how much water it would take them to produce that good. Now, if we look at the indirect water use, and so this is based on input-output models, this is the Latif equation. So this is the environmentally extended version of the input-output model with our water footprints that we calculated earlier, multiplied by our not to get into a lot of detail because it's perhaps not as important, but this is final production, this is a technical coefficient, and then identity matrix. But basically with this, the output of this will be how much water is used to produce said good. So if we want to look at the indirect water use, the major player here comes back again to the agriculture sector and the actual production of the sugar cane and sugar beets themselves. So depending on where they source these from, it can be a couple orders of magnitude different. So one thing I want to make sure we point out here, we're looking at just blue water here. So why there's such a discrepancy here? Well, it's because this area is in the low end, it's sourcing from mainly rain-fed sugar cane and sugar beet production, so using very little irrigation water to produce those. Whereas here, we're looking at areas that have very little rainfall, instead require a tremendous amount of irrigation in order to produce that same product. And if we sum up all the other industries, indirect water uses, which are numbered in the 100, we just kind of aggregate them here, and even aggregated together, still much less than the agriculture component. But in total, if you look at all the total water use back through the entire supply chain, we can see, again, orders of magnitude different in the total amount of water that is being produced. And so this sets the stage now for this water footprint benchmarks that we want to do. So we collected this data, we created this data set that we can now exploit to understand how water is used in the economy and where there could be areas of potential savings. And so this figure, and this comes from the previous study, illustrates that the significant changes or variance between blue water footprints per unit of production within a given sector and also between economic sectors. And what we really want to exploit here is the difference within a sector and understand how what factors influence these differences. And so we're not going to get down to the specific, understanding the specific differences on whether it's water pricing or the technology they employ, but we just want to distinguish between environmental factors, things that they can't control, versus things that they can control. And so the key question driving this research is, what if all water users adjusted their water use to match their industry benchmark level? And so to kind of illustrate this question, we've got this industry, and it's shown here in orange, and they use, let's say, they're pretty efficient water users. And so for every $1,000 or dollar of economic productions coming from this industry, it takes them X amount of water to produce that good. Okay, and that's shown here as kind of how much water in that little cylinder is required to produce that. Now we have the exact same industry, but perhaps located just a county over, or even with the same region. And to produce that same good, they require a lot more water, maybe double the amount of water that the other industry has. And now that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because the first industry that uses water more efficiently has newer technology. It could be because water is priced differently in each of the scenarios, or maybe the second one that uses more water is self-supplied as opposed to buying their water from a public supplier. It could just be better management practices. But whatever the reason is, Industry A, the first one, uses less water to produce the same good as Industry B. And so if we kind of hold all things constant, considering, again, we want to make sure we're keeping the industries the same because they have different processes, and we want to make sure we account for other factors like technology differences when we talk about like thermoelectric power generation, or if climate differences, which it can also be a factor. If we account for all of those and kind of bin or cluster our regions, our industries accordingly, there's these human decision points that we can control will help us. If we can adjust those, we can perhaps get this industry to more reasonable and already achieved levels of water use. And so what happens if we do that? Well, we can have, tremendous amount of water savings. And that's not just for this industry. This example is just for this one industry. But look, what happens if we look across all industries? And so now we figure out in a similar process how much water can be saved across all industries, and where that water can be saved. And so if we do that, and we do that across the entire country, this offers the potential for great amount of water savings. And so that's where we want to calculate, and that's when we want to determine where these water savings can occur. And so one important thing I want to make sure I highlight here is this isn't kind of a top-down approach where we say you should be using this much water to do your processes based on some kind of pie-in-the-sky expectation of what reasonable water use is. Instead, we use the data itself to kind of infer what has already been achieved. And so we know that is a reasonable water use, given similar production processes and comparable conditions, especially when we're talking about environmental conditions. And so we set different benchmark levels to see how much water could be saved depending on where we set that level. So this shows like a distribution of the water use intensity. So amount of water per dollar of production, with the area on the left being more efficient water users. They're getting more kind of bang for your buck, more using less water for the amount of production that's being produced. And so the BM10 is basically if we move all water users to the right that are less efficient to that 10 percentile, the 10th percentile, how much water could we save? That's the BM10 scenario. We also looked at the BM25 scenario, which that's basically moving all the water users to the right to this 25th percentile. And so the users that are less efficient now move to that level. And then lastly, we also looked at the BM50 scenario, the median. So if you basically use all water users that are not efficient to the median water user or better, then how much water can be saved? And so we did these three scenarios just to kind of see how sensitive our analysis was to each of where we set that benchmark level. We're going to mainly focus the rest of this presentation on the BM25 scenario, mainly because throughout the literature, that's kind of the level that most people aim for, is to set water users, the least efficient water users should move to the 25th percentile or better. So the next few slides will show our results on that particular scenario. And so to calculate the potential water savings, we did this we wanted to account for environmental conditions that might impact water use. So we didn't think it was reasonable to assume that an industry located in Minnesota would it be expected to have the same water requirement or water use as one in Arizona, right? And so we used the NOAA climate regions, and we came upon that decision based off the paper that I show, the kind of a snippet there at the top that was published in 2017, I believe, maybe 2017. That looked at public water supply, and they looked at the major factors that are driving public water supply within the United States. And so they found several things, but one of the major drivers that kept coming up over and over again was climate. And so we chose that one to kind of delineate our different areas. And within each area, we looked at, for a given industry, we looked at other water users within the area in the same industry, and perhaps, when again talking about thermoelectric power production, use the same technologies or same fuel type. So holding all those things constant and kind of building a subset of our data based on those parameters, we looked at the distribution of water use to determine how water was being used, or how much production could be produced with a certain amount of water, or alternatively, how much water is being used to produce a certain level of production. And from that, we could then calculate our total water savings. And so this shows for industrial, institutional, and commercial water footprints. We did this for over 350 different industries. Because it's difficult to show in this presentation, here we aggregated them to the North American Industrial Classification System, 2-digit description. And so these are aggregated up, and we show those same distributions I showed earlier are going to be shown here again, this time in terms of cubic meters of water per $1,000 of production. So you can see that within each sector, there's this wide variability, and this doesn't show within each region. This is the national estimate. In our actual study, when we do our analysis, we break this down by region as well, and do our analysis. Again, a little bit overwhelming trying to show that all on this slide, but this gives you kind of a general idea of how we did this. Again, to reiterate, you can kind of see there's a wide distribution within each industry and also between different industries. That's a little bit, I don't want to say misleading, but they're a little bit narrower than we're showing here, again, because we aggregate all these sectors together for the visual purposes within this presentation. Back to the manufacturing example I gave earlier, so manufacturing shown here, and you kind of see this wide range of potential values. This includes bread manufacturing and car manufacturing within this same diagram. However, in our actual study, we break those apart and look at those individually. And so that will be reflected in our actual study, whereas this visual shows everything put together. For crops, we followed a methodology first employed by a paper that was published in Nature in 2012, looking at closing yield gaps. And so what they did was they basically broke the world down into different regions based on growing degree days and precipitation. And then they said, okay, within each of these regions, we're going to look at crop yields, and we're going to have some distribution of crop yields. And we can say, okay, well, it's been shown that a crop yield of X can be achieved within this region. And therefore, since they share similar environmental conditions, we're going to assume then that those yields can be reasonably achieved by everyone within that region. And so in that way, they showed how much extra potential production could be achieved, crop production could be achieved, if we're able to close those yield gaps. Well, we did something similar, but instead of precipitation, we used the aridity index, which is a function of both precipitation and potential evapotranspiration. So you can see this here. We use growing degree days, and so that's the number of days that are above a certain temperature, so basically when the crops can actually grow. And so we divide the country into 81 different regions, and we did this for each crop. And so this is for wheat. And so this is masked with where wheat's actually grown within the United States. And so within a region, so this is a kind of a region here within Texas, we assume that wheat grown within this region farmers should be able to achieve a similar level of yield for the similar level of water input. Now, those are going to vary a little bit, but in general, that we expect that to be the case. And so even though we expect that to be the case, that the empirical data we have on crop yields suggests that that's not always the case, and there's some variance there, and we use average yields to do that. And so what we want to look at is take the water used to produce that crop and the yields that correspond to that, and be able to set those benchmarks, much like the distribution we saw earlier, such that the least efficient water users can now be raised to some benchmark level. And like I said, we've been mainly focusing on the 25th percentile. And we want to know how much water can be saved across all these crops and in different regions of the country. And so that's what we show in this figure, and I'll kind of set this up. We did this at the grid scale level. Again, we aggregated results for the sake of for visual purposes, and so we used the same kind of NOAA climate regions here again within this study, or within this figure, even though we do it at a much finer scale. And we're going to show the water savings in cubic kilometers per year on the y-axis, and then each of the regions is shown here. And so we do this for 26 crops. These 26 crops represent nearly 99% of all crops that are grown within the United States. And so this is going to be for all three scenarios. And so you can see this is the BM10, as you expect. If we move all water uses to the most efficient, to the 10th percentile, then we're going to experience the greatest water savings. In the 25th percentile and the 50th, we see water savings, but less than we would expect if we move to even more efficient levels of water use. And this breaks it down by region. You can also see the breakdown by crop too. The largest percentage of these crops water savings is going to be for corn, alfalfa, and soybeans, where we see the greatest amount of savings that can occur. And that's largely reflects that those are the three crops that are grown most widely across the United States and often grown in somewhat arid regions as well. And so that was looking at just crops. So if we aggregate all these together and we look at all industries and crop production, we can see that there's tremendous amount of water savings that can occur across the watersheds. And we want to show this. This is the HUC4, so these are major watersheds across the United States, showing the amount of water that can be saved in different regions within the United States. So you see some of these can be actually quite significant. And these often correspond to areas of water scarcity, with the red areas showing the red tinted HUC4s here showing river basins that show relative amounts of water scarcity. The red grid cells show areas of groundwater depletion that are occurring across the United States. And so you can see there's a strong overlap here between where water can be saved and where water is being overused. On the high end, we can expect up to 18,000. This is about 1.8 cubic kilometers of water per year. And some of these more blue tinted basins can be saved. For a point of comparison, nearly 50% of all of these HUC4s have less reservoir storage in them than the amount of water that can be saved. And that's not to say we should go and remove all these dams if we're able to save all this water, because we're not accounting for intra and interannual variability in water supplies. But perhaps what it does suggest is that we can think about reallocating that water for other purposes if we start to conserve water, are really serious about conserving water in different basins across the U.S. And that water can be reallocated to growing demands, new demands, but also environmental flows and the like across much of the West and elsewhere within the United States. So now we want to look at direct versus indirect water savings. So on the y-axis, you see all these are the different NAICS sectors that I talked about earlier. So we aggregated our results to these broader sectors for visual purposes. Indirect water savings is on your y-axis here, and so that's again going to represent how much water is used back through the supply chain, how much water can be saved in this case back through their supply chains if they source goods from more efficient water users, and then how much water can be saved directly through improved water efficiencies within a given facility or farm field. And so if we plot the results, as you might expect, we see large direct water savings in the crop sector. Manufacturing, which requires a tremendous amount of inputs to produce their goods, can experience a lot more indirect water savings, and a lot of the other ones are kind of lay in between. And so that kind of, again, shows where when we're thinking about corporations are becoming more cognizant of their environmental impact and thinking of ways that they can reduce that, this study lays the groundwork for understanding that perhaps when you're talking about reducing your environmental impact, and in this case water, it might not be by making changes in your own facilities, but instead making changes throughout your suppliers or where you get your goods from can have a tremendous impact on your overall environmental footprint. So now I want to wrap up, talk about a few kind of concluding remarks and future directions that we hope to go from this study. And so in summary, if you look at USGS's water use reports that have come out for the last several decades, you've probably noticed there's a trend in reduced water use. Even though population has been growing, especially when we're talking about public water supply, we've seen kind of the trend hold steady or in some cases decline. Now, it's unclear if that's because of change of methodology or just improved efficiencies or perhaps a little bit of both. But regardless of which one it is, this study shows there's still significant water savings to be achieved. We also show that areas facing water stress show some of the greatest potential for water savings. So there is hope that we can use water more efficiently, but also and make sure we have a thriving economy, but also leave enough water for the environmental purposes as well. Secondly, I want to highlight that most industries can save more water by working with their suppliers to reduce their water use, rather than spending a lot of money to save water directly in their own operations. And then lastly, I want to highlight that future research is needed that we didn't really get into here to understand the inherent trade-offs involved in improved water utilization. So using water more efficiently might require other inputs or increase in other inputs like energy or fertilizer consumption, which could lead to impacts back to the water again, gray water and water quality issues, but also things when we talk about energy, carbon footprints, and the like. So although this work presents a first step in better understanding how water is used in the economy and the potential for water conservation, is by no means the last step. The reason this work was necessitated and we felt that it was necessary to pursue was because of this incomplete data. We don't have, as I talked at the very opening of this talk, we don't have the data that we often desire from water meters. And so that necessitates it, but it also can limit our study. And some of the conclusions we can ultimately make are constrained because of data limitations. So we have to be careful in that respect. But it also highlights the need for this data and for collaborations between state and federal agencies who collect this data, as well as non-federal researchers to help both collect, synthesize, and analyze the data. And this needs to be done at both finer sectorial resolution. So the USGS currently reports it across 8 sectors. But, we're showing how it can potentially be beneficial to do it at a much finer level. Temporal resolution and across, moving from annual estimates, which we did here, to monthly or perhaps even daily. And then finally, a finer spatial resolution. So the good news is that some initial work's already been laid down for this. And so USGS is trying to totally revitalize their water use program, moving from estimates every 5 years, or done every 5 years at an annual scale, to estimates on a daily time step for some sectors, and moving from county estimates to HUC 12 estimates is kind of their lofty goal. And hopefully we can certainly help with that. Also, we've had initial discussions with folks at the Census Bureau, and they're trying to bring back questions that were last posed in the 1980s dealing with industrial water use and how water is used throughout the economy. So we're hopeful that those questions get added to the next census of industry, and that will certainly help our research and understanding how water is used within the economy. So that wraps up this talk. And again, my name is Landon Marston, and my research explores interactions between water and society. So I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone may have. And I will leave my last slide here in case you're interested in the initial study that I highlighted, and that if you want to get your hands on the data that we base this study off of, there's information on how to do so within this slide. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to receiving any questions.
Okay, so I'm looking at the questions board and I don't see any. Am I missing something?
Hey, Ben, this is Danielle. I don't see any questions either. So if you do have questions, you can type them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel.
Yeah, so we'll give you a minute to do that. I think we still have about 5 minutes for questions, so we'll take at least one, maybe a few. I'll go ahead and type those in.
Mark Johnson said, great talk, still digesting the info. That was a lot of really great information. So.
Okay, so we're digesting the info. So Landon, I saw a copy, or I saw a preliminary figure late in the talk. It was looking at the total amount of water that could be saved by switching to benchmarks or best practices in the industry. And I was wondering what the percentages look like in terms of percent savings by region. Are there regions where we could save a large fraction of the water? What are those?
Yeah, Ben, that's a great question. I don't remember for each region. I don't remember the specific numbers. In general, depending on where the benchmark levels are set, I want to say it ranged from like 10 to as much as 40% water savings, depending on, again, how inefficiently water is being used, the industries that are within that particular region. But I think that certainly highlights that there's a tremendous amount of water that could be saved by shifting to, again, already existing practices that are in place.
Yeah. There was a question asking for a copy of this WR paper. So the DOI is on the screen. The title is High Resolution Water Footprints of Production of the United States. That's in WRR last year. So you'll be able to download that.
Yeah, we hope to have the benchmark paper submitted in the coming months. And so hopefully that will be available by the end of the year. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, a question from Tim Ward. We've seen volume of water saved, but what about the cost saving or the dollar saving by reducing water use?
That's a great question, Tim. That would obviously be something we would like to address and bring in more of the economic component. It gets a little bit challenging to do that simply because we don't know. Perhaps that's a trade-off rather than potential economic savings, because to use water more efficiently can sometimes mean that we have to invest in new technologies or different technologies, and so that could be a constraint that could keep us from achieving these water savings without some type of incentive structure to encourage companies to do so. But right now, with many areas or many types of areas of production and types of production receiving very cheap water, or in some cases when they're self-supplied free water, there's little incentive for them to make that shift. But perhaps as water becomes more scarce in areas, and like we saw in California recently, where they imposed water use restrictions, these type of considerations might, it might make the dynamic might become more favorable for them to use water more efficiently in those cases.
All right, next question from Elizabeth Smith. We associate certain industries with certain regions and assume, I suppose, that those industries are located in the right places based on what they are. For example, near raw resources or transportation hubs. What do you think, Landon, about industries that stood out to you in terms of being poorly located?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And this isn't just from my research, I think from others. Some of us suggested, as I alluded to earlier, the tremendous benefit that can be gained from utilizing rainfall to grow crops, and so more rain-fed crop production. Right now, we're growing crops in places sometimes that don't necessarily make sense, and again, it's because of the way that water becomes available to people and the way that it's priced. But some people suggest that maybe the way around that is just to price water at its marginal value, and so the kind of a scarcity value. I'm originally from Kentucky, and so I've kind of seen the impacts of using a non-renewable resource like groundwater. Now I'm living in Kansas, and in Kentucky it was on coal. And so what happens is when either regulations come in or we overexploit the resource, it leaves these areas desolate, right? There's a lot of poverty that's left behind because what kept the economy going was that particular industry, then it's removed. So we have to be cognizant of this playing out again with water, like it has in other places with other natural resources. If we put tight restrictions, or we're just thinking from a water-centric standpoint, how do we conserve water without thinking of the broader economy and the impact it has on people, it could have dramatic impacts. And so this is really, although this study looked more from a water-centric kind of viewpoint, we have to take a more holistic viewpoint when we're talking about actually moving industries and shifting areas of production, because it can have far-reaching impacts. I didn't get into this study, or another study we're looking at that maybe more specifically answer your question is there's a growing propensity of data centers that are popping up across the U.S., and those require a tremendous amount of energy, and because of that and also water, but because of the energy production requires a tremendous amount of indirect water use as well. And so that separate study that we're doing from this is looking at that, and we're finding that all of those are located in places where water is relatively scarce, because they often don't look at water, but instead of availability of energy production, or energy that's available in cheap land. So that could be one industry that needs a little more attention on how we place those and the environmental impacts that could potentially have.
One more question. We're almost out of time. Landon, did you consider, or how did you consider recycled water consumption?
So that was considered indirectly, because we looked at the total amount of water that's being used, that's being consumed. And so if they use, we're not looking at withdrawals, we're looking at consumption. So if they recirculate the water and use it over and over again, again, we're not interested in how much they withdraw, but how much they consume, which that's going to be roughly the same. There's a little bit difference, especially if you look like at thermoelectric power could kind of maybe be a good example for that, even though it's not exactly what we're talking about with recycled water. But you have two different technologies that are mainly employed: the once through, which basically uses the water once and puts it back in the river, versus the recirculating, that recycles the water and uses the same water over and over again. And from the empirical data we have on that, that suggests that although the water withdrawal levels are significantly different, the once through uses a lot more water as far as withdrawal terms than recirculated technologies. But when you talk about consumption, they're roughly the same. The recirculated uses a little bit more in terms of water consumption. But in general, like I said, it's kind of embedded within our analysis, but we don't look at that specifically.
Okay, 1 minute to the top of the hour. I'm going to end it there. Of course, please feel free to reach out to Landon with follow-up questions. Thanks again to CUAHSI. I will turn it back over to our host. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Landon, for the talk. And thank you all for joining this Cyberseminar series. And please tune in next week on February 27th, same time, same place, for the Water Network of the United States with Tara Troy from Lehigh University. All right, have a great day. And again, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and reach out to Landon with his email at the bottom. All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.